Welcome back to Manufacturing Intelligence, the relaxed conversational video series on all things digital tech and pharmaceutical manufacturing and development, featuring Rick Jaenisch, Senior Director of Education, Outreach, and Digital Experience at Open BioPharma, and Chris Cole, Associate Editorial Director for PharmTech. In this episode, we answer the questions. What exactly is a digital twin? What makes digital twins particularly useful in pharma manufacturing? Where are digital twins currently being applied in pharma manufacturing? What does it mean to use digital twins to run simulations that define the perfect golden batch parameters? What does it take to move beyond single unit operations for digital twins to simulate entire manufacturing lines? Where does AI fit into the digital twin use? And what's on the horizon for digital twin use in pharma manufacturing? I think we need to start with the basics. So what exactly is a digital twin?
Yeah. So in this case, let's start with the FDA's AI glossary definition of a digital twin, which is a set of information it's a set of information constructs that mimic the structure, context, and behavior of a physical asset. It's dynamically updated with data from its physical twin throughout its life cycle and informs decisions. It's a bi-directional interaction between the virtual and the physical center to the digital twin. Digital twins can enable personalized medical applications. For example, the digital twin of a patient could inform clinical decisions, such as treatment options and clinical assessments. In addition, digital twins play a role in assembling large cohorts for in silico clinical trials. Conceptually, in silico is also a digital twin. And in quality assessments for process optimization for drug manufacturing processes, there are so many applications of digital twin, but digital twin, if you're just starting off right from the basics, it could be anything from a data table, because I think a lot of people, when they think digital twin, they think, they're a little bit stuck in the metaverse, maybe. Maybe they think and they go, oh yeah, I remember it has this virtual component that you can interact with and I can pick it up. And I think that may be a bit too futuristic. I think there are certain types of digital twins where that's really useful and applicable. But if you're a scientist and you're, looking at your digital twin of your lab environment, I don't think it matters if you can look into the microscope or not. You just want to be able to parse through the images quickly. So the type of digital twin, how they're arranged, matter depending upon the application. But a large function of it, is the idea here is that it's basically a data set, right? It's that virtual component of a real world. And the important thing is that it is in fact real. It's not necessarily real time, but it is usually close to real time. So it is updated based on the information happening in the environment itself. So if you do not have that component, you have a virtual model. So if you have a virtual model, that's cool. That's a great thing to have. But if it isn't updated with either real time or somewhat periodic updates regarding your other data, it's not really it's not really a digital twin. It's a virtual model. So most people will start with a virtual model and then kind of add in that data to turn it into a digital twin.
Yeah. So as far as the pharmaceutical manufacturing world, what makes digital twins particularly useful? And then, what foundational information should people in this field know about them?
So a big thing about digital twins is that conceptually we're talking about risk reduction pretty much immediately, because the thing is what you're doing is you're saying, well, if these are all my inputs and these are going to be all my outputs and those are known, the benefit is you can say, well, I'm not going to run my batch. I'm not going to run this thing. I'm going to run it through a virtual model first, and see how that works. Or if I have a digital twin, it's even better because there I'm going to run it through my digital twin, and my digital twin has that. It's a virtual model of the digital twin functionally. But like the idea here is that they're taking this digital twin that has that real-time data and they're going, okay, so if this is what's happening here, they'll produce a certain amount of results saying this is what we expect to happen. And those expectations can help inform the virtual model so that the virtual model can actually run something ahead of time. So say for instance, I wanted to make a new batch of tablets or something. And I have my process, I have my whole system, I have my whole GMP system that's great and it works and I know it works, but now I'm working on a new tablet and it's different. And so what I can do is I can use my digital twin and I can go, hey, what if I take my inputs that I know through all the factors that I have, and we run it through this and we see what happens. And the benefit there is you can run it multiple times. You could run hundreds, thousands of times on that model faster than you could run one run. And so the
Mm.
benefit is you can run a lot of possibilities and see, oh, okay, well, these are some potential errors we should pay attention to. And it lets you really kind of, help reduce that risk. Now, one of the challenges there is that obviously one of the biggest thing that you usually have with a deviation, one of the biggest sources of deviations is people. So human error is not usually fully accounted for in a digital twin in this sense, typically. So you can try to use that with deviations and other stuff, but typically speaking, it's kind of avoided. So largely speaking, this is about the looking at the model and saying, is this good? Does this work? And is there something we can tweak? And what happens if we swap a piece of equipment? You can do a lot of things to that space. Like for instance, at Open BioPharma, one of the things that we did was that we're looking at our clean room environment that we're going to be building out, and one of our goals is to be able to switch out very quickly. I think about how CDMOs operate, and they need to be able to kind of quick out the space, and so a digital twin there is super useful because they can build out. Oh, they go, okay, well, this is what we have right now. What if we change everything that's here? You know, we have the data on the equipments and how they operate in these spaces. Let's see what it looks like here, and let's see if this arrangement works or this structure works. Because often, like where you place your equipment matters, the arrangement of your equipment matters. All of these things really have important features, and so you can figure out how that works. And the same thing goes for the actual batch consistency, right? You can make an assumption. The digital twin gets you pretty close. It's not perfect by any means because to do that would require so many sensors, so much data that maybe data that you're not even watching, because like maybe you don't have your particle measuring system, put into play. Maybe you don't have an environmental monitoring system put into play. Maybe you don't have maybe your digital twin is incomplete, which it usually, technically speaking, it's almost always kind of like incomplete just because like how many sensors do you need to create a perfect sample? But the thing is, it gives you a great idea. And that's super helpful. I want to say that, if you're trying to reduce the risk, especially when you're assembling that first bit, that will help a lot. And it goes across from stem to stern, right? It's not just in the clean room environment, it's every space in between. It's going through, and you could do it to a degree with people as well. And you can say, well, these are the data here we have. What are we seeing here? But that requires a lot of data on people that you probably don't have, because most people aren't collecting that data. But lab data, though, when people are looking at it, going like, well, we're doing the small scale, the pilot scale, you can even take something like that. That's a really cool thing, is looking at scale up too. So that's another area. So it's risk reduction and then also potentially scale up. So digital twin lets you go, okay, well, if this works in a small environment, what do we need to do to amplify it? What happens if we take this 10-liter fermenter and then suddenly use a 1,000-liter fermenter? Obviously huge change. Does everything scale up properly? Is there a change in the scale up? Do we have to think about those pieces? And so the benefit is the digital twin lets you play around with that and see how that might work. And so that's a really cool application, is both between risk reduction and scale up. Those are two really prominent use cases, although there are lots more depending upon the specific application of digital twin.
Yes, so I would think a lot of time reduction as well. Like you're saying, like, test it out with these thousands of the different variations,
Yeah.
see what makes the most sense, what's going to work best, and then try that out for real before just going to trying it out for
Yeah.
real and then failing and failing and failing. Yeah.
Yeah. Let the computer fail.
Right, right.
Yeah. Cheaper that
Um,
way.
yes. Yeah, it's cheaper and faster and yeah, everything. I
Yes.
think. Um, so what are some other ways that these digital twins are currently being used in pharma manufacturing?
So they're being used. I think when most people think about digital twin, they're thinking about that virtual space. And so when we think about that, I think about the construction industry, the facilities themselves, how they're being built, how that space is being built. And so that is an area that has been there for quite some time. So it's quite mature. So when we see that, we often end up seeing, these very like straight up like, Google Maps type situation where you can just walk through the whole building, see the dimensions of things. Some of them will even take CAD models of the equipment and put them into the space. So you can actually look at the CAD, you can actually look at that and diagnose problems right then and there. And, for some people that can really help. Like if you're doing like a Gemba walk and you can do a virtual Gemba walk and that can be useful. So there are lots of, interesting kind of things that are being applied right now. And usually that also helps with when it comes to facilities change. So like in our case at Open, like we're going to change up that room. We have a 1,400 square foot ballroom that we're going to change up with every single pilot batch that comes in. Just like a CDMO might be changing its space up frequently as well. There they have to go, okay, well, how do we plan for the next batch? What are we doing for the next batch? And so the benefit there is we can then rearrange that room, do all those pieces. And that's what we've done with one of our groups, one of the digital twins that we've worked with. And so these digital twins, are really about facilities management, and they'll connect to your BMS, they'll connect to your different systems there, and they can also connect to some elements of training too. Because if you think about it, if you walk into a room and you have a piece of equipment, right, and what I've seen this done prominently with is with AR technology. And so AR is augmented reality. And so what they'll do is they'll put on the cool glasses. I can't wear them, unfortunately. I am too blind to do so. My vision is too poor. So I tend not to do well with the environments, which is a bummer because I love the idea. I'm able to put them on for about 5 minutes until I can't do it anymore. So I'm not always the best use case for the situation, but I always appreciate how intricate this is. So when I put on the AR goggles and I'm looking at it, I can see the digital work instruction as it moves through the space. The digital space there, the digital work instruction is really helpful way for a little bit of training. So you can actually do some training with these tools too. Because if you think about it, where you're, running through your scenarios, you should also run through with people. And so training can become a useful strategy with digital work instruction there too. When you apply it and you can see the step-by-steps on where you should move in the equipment and go, oh, I'm moving here, moving here, moving here. It's kind of neat. I've seen it done and it seems to have its usefulness. And it can walk you through, exactly how to move it through. And so that is one potential application. That is, sorry, not potential. That is an actual application that is working on, that actually happens right now in pharma, where people will learn that way or do things that way or have a bit more than just a read and understand SOP situation where they have to, do a corrective action and they go, well, let me learn from this and let me learn from this human error. Now I have a cute little AR goggles I'm going through here and I'm seeing all my digital work instructions so I know what the real steps are and I have to follow through them. It can also be helpful in something you don't do that often, So there, another thing I've seen is where they'll take, instead of using the digital, the AR tool, they'll just use a tablet. Right. And they'll just have it be a tablet overlay, which is the same fundamentals. But the difference is you're kind of seeing it over it and you're like, okay, is this right? Is it there? It kind of reminds me of like wiring diagrams, when you're looking at like a wire, when you're looking at the pieces underneath, and it's almost like an X-ray kind of thing where you're being able to see kind of the hidden
Yeah.
bits because again, you have the CAD drawing. So you literally have this kind of X-ray that you're kind of seeing through, but it's not real. It's not really an X-ray. But it's very useful in that sense. That's one application. Then we also see a lot of containers. So I thought this was the coolest thing about 2.5 years ago. I first started seeing like people using sensors in like everything. They're like obviously RFID, throw it onto every little tool and you can track where it is in through your warehouse. And then that becomes digital twin component too. Because
Mm.
because every sensor you adds, to the robustness of a digital twin, right? So a digital twin becomes much better the more data you have that is related to your approach. Because obviously, the more data you have, that doesn't necessarily make the twin better. You need specific data. And so inventory data becomes really useful because then you can kind of watch your flow of how things are moving. You can see when you need to refill batches. When you can see when you need those things are there. Some of them are, on the actual vials themselves or on a sample vial. Like say you have like a set of vials there and like one of them is your sample vial. And so that this way it can help detect that something's wrong with that batch run, or it can be set on the actual equipment itself. And so that this way it's checking to those pieces, or it can be on a camera that's focused on them and is looking at it that way. So there are tons of different ways it can look at the actual containers themselves that will end up being the final product. It can also be on the front end too. So if you're doing the science components, I've seen one where it's like a smart scale, where it's actually a fully digital scale that connects to your inventory and stuff. So it's actually weighing exactly how much you're taking out each time and making sure that those are properly accounted for. Because, sometimes, you accidentally, move a little bit too much or something like that, or there's loss. Sometimes you have a bit more loss than you might expect because of heat, because of light, because of where it was stored, and maybe there was a factor you weren't accounting for, and now you can see it because you're weighing it there. Um, and then there is also, again, as I mentioned, the cameras where you can actually look at, what people are doing, how people are doing it, and what's the risk in what they're doing. And you can kind of assess that. And so that's another digital twin application. So there are tons of these different things. There are, I gotta say, probably like maybe about 100 different companies in life sciences that all have very different applications of digital twins. So I think people will see the word everywhere, and associated with completely different things. Um, and so
Yeah.
that may be a little bit confusing for people. So I'm hoping that this exchange helps people, demystify what is this.
Yep. Yeah, that's the goal. Okay, so I've read, a little bit about using digital twins to run simulations that define the perfect golden batch parameters.
Yeah.
What is that?
So, like I said before, if you have a lot of sensors, if you have really good sensors, conceptually speaking, you could have a situation where you don't have the errors from those tools. Your digital twin could tell you this is the right pathway to go. It's a little bit it's a little bit better than monkeys writing Shakespeare because it doesn't need to have, it's more like interns writing Shakespeare. Okay. They're not that great still, but like they need a little bit more like time to get that thing right. And so the benefit is that the digital twin has that time. Does that time. And so it's able to produce you, like I said, that one path of like, this is the path. And the benefit is the SMEs involved know they can just they're the ones who will determine what best path to take. So they'll look at that and go, this is the good path. This is where all the data here aligns. What do we need to do to make that happen? And then obviously, changing your system and structure, is obvious, in terms of your quality system, you might have to make some changes, and that requires a whole another set of considerations. But to get that golden batch, it's entirely conceivable that a very robust digital twin would make it significantly easier to have less um, batch failure generally, and more importantly, have more consistency on your batch, and which personally as a patient I'm stoked for. I often read and go, oh no, it turns out my in my case one of the meds I take is Prograf because I'm a transplant recipient, and so if that level's low or high, like I can do not well. I will not be doing well. And if that's consistent, then it's an even more big of a problem. So I really care about that batch consistency. And so it's really helpful to know that you are producing exceptionally high consistency on your batch. And the thing is, it doesn't sound like a patient like, on the street would normally care about that unless you like drilled it down and told them what that all that meant.
Right.
But it matters to patients a lot. So it's really helpful that, people are using this digital twin to try to get to that golden batch. And I think that, they're going to be more likely to get to it with a robust digital twin.
Yeah, there's probably margins of error that are allowed through the regulatory bodies and whatnot.
Yeah.
I guess the golden batch keeps you within those parameters, or even better.
Well, everything is going to be a range. I mean, there's no way I think from any of these systems to like have like perfect consistency. It's always going to be just maybe a very very small range out of the piece, as long as it's acceptable in the acceptable range. And I'm sure that the golden batch is defined differently based on your organization, and it's probably a goal, and you're probably like, this is what we want, this is our sample, and it's a good thing to have because the data wise, that if you have if you have examples of what your golden batch is, it is more easy for the digital twin to get you to that conclusion.
So,
Easy.
yeah, we sort of talked about something like single unit operations. And Team's digital twins are kind of moving beyond that to stimulate entire manufacturing lines. So, what does it actually take to accomplish that, from equipment to software to
Oh,
personnel?
so it's kind of depending upon how deep you want to go. So generally speaking, if we're talking about a full manufacturing line, you're talking about having activated sensors. Now, I'm going to assume that this is, again, clean room environment, moving the space, all these things like that. It means you're going to have, you already have probably half these sensors in there anyway, because you already need to do your environmental monitoring. You're already monitoring with visual inspection. You're already monitoring. So some of these pieces are already pulling data. The thing is, the unification of that data is
Mm.
probably where I think we see a lot of the difficulty. Because even still, I think about the facilities component, that's connected to a building management system. Well, your building management system probably isn't connected to your LIMS system, which probably maybe isn't fully connected to your inventory system. And maybe that's not so like there are so many pieces. So conceptually, they would need to have a really good hub. And there are some kinds of hubs that are close to hubs, that try to do that. And then there are also systems that, will provide uh, kind of a few of the spaces in between they're trying to fill. Because the challenge with this is that, there are so many different inputs to monitor that the choice of software aligning with this is that you could have genuinely like 30 or 40 different pieces of software. And, if you're a big company, dude, you can handle it. You can make those decisions. You can figure out what's going where. Um, One of the things about the digital twin that really empowers it in this space, and the really thing that's the necessary to make it work in this space, is going to obviously be the AI application that comes into it, right? When I think of one of the most amazing things about generative AI is that its ability for its but the two main things that it really does well are needle in a haystack, which is finding the thing that you need it to find,
Mm.
which is great for looking for errors. So you can have a tool that's basically just looking all the time throughout this system for the specific abnormalities and specifically for them and goes, these are the out of spec functions that we want to get rid of. And so that's useful. And that's a really great strategy, but that's another piece of software that comes into play. And so like at Open, we, happen to work with a smaller organization with Pickle, and we created a bespoke tool for this purpose, and that's what we're using for it. But the thing is, even still, we can't do all the things, so we're still connecting with other systems that come into play, and so it's a matter of what data is being pulled from each one. How is that data working with the other data? Usually, I want to say a lot of folks, I've seen like usually making a data warehouse or a data lake where all of this data will sit, and then they'll try to, they'll try to make sense of it, try to make it work with some internal tool, or try to use one of the tools they have to try to kind of like massage it. I've seen people use a tool in ways that maybe it wasn't intended, but it works, right? I mean, I want to say that's half of the engineering of a mindset is being able to go, how do I make this do the thing I need it to do when it does 70% of what I need it to do? Because that's most software, right? Most software does, 60 to 70% of what you want. And so you need to take the elements of what you want and then get another piece of software to do the rest of the stuff. So, like I said, it's a big software stack, and that's one element. Then you have your hardware stack. So you're going to need to have sensors in all these pieces. Half these sensors are already here because you're in pharma manufacturing, and if you don't have these sensors, like I'm a little concerned. Like you should have some level of your environmental monitoring. Maybe it's someone going in with a unit, that's fine too. But it's nicer when you have consistency with these tools. So these tools, digital twins, really require almost real-time data. If you have real-time data, phenomenal. Great for you. Your bandwidth is probably really high, and you have a lot of pieces, you have a lot of sensors. So you're going to need to have sensors in your clean room. You're going to need to have sensors on your equipment that you're receiving, equipment in your packaging, in your equipment sensors before you even get into the clean room. You're going to have sensors when they're received. You're going to have sensors in the inventory. There are lots and lots of sensors that are going to be in play, and these sensors can be anything from physical RFIDs, which is usually a component so you can see where things are moving. They're probably, and so because because we think about things, we're like, oh, I'm watching it, I can see it move, I know what it's doing. That's not how computers think. So a camera might be able to record how things are moving, but it really can't necessarily easily identify everything unless it sees the number. Amazon had this problem when they made the grocery store, when they made their like those the
Oh
grocery
yeah,
store
yeah.
you could just walk out with. The big challenge was, and my brother actually helped, was working with colleagues who were on this project, and he was like, there are so many sensors in that grocery store. There are thousands of cameras, and in order to even make it work, you still had to have some people watching the cameras, because it was just so complicated for that type of thing. And that is a literal digital twin of the store. So now, granted, sensors have improved, and AI has enhanced a lot of our ability to monitor these things in a faster way. But that being said, uh, it is still a matter of going, okay, well, we're in the clean room environment. Okay, well, we're in these other spaces. What are all the spend sensors on there? And that's just the equipment and the product. It's not the people. So cameras also people. So when people are there, obviously you have an RFID in your badge tag. So that's one way to monitor where people are going when it comes to what rooms they're in, how long they're spending in those rooms, what those pieces are, which could have an impact based on, A, your environmental monitoring, or B, even your aseptic process. Because if someone's in there too long, they could start sweating, and that adds another impact, and like maybe that's something to consider. And then you also have the matter of the cameras. And so you would need a lot of cameras to properly figure out how a person is moving through those spaces. And so, or well-positioned cameras. So, one of the things that we've toyed with is putting specific cameras on our biosafety cabinets while we're doing pipetting and things like that, so that we can help improve pipetting, sort of like a combination of, like, the football coach going like, you moved here, and like, there's you encircling the thing and saying this, that, and so we can show people.
Yep.
But in a deeper level, also having AI actually analyze it and say, what are we, how fast are we moving? How are we doing these things? It's one of the elements that a digital twin of a training environment can actually give you, that's something that like a real world environment can't. You can actually see exactly how fast you're moving. And if you start to see that type of thing, and this is relevant for this type of digital twin too, where if you have information on how fast you move and you understand how fast you move, it allows you to control that via muscle memory pretty well. So if you know that, like, moving like this, is like half a mile an hour or something like that, exactly, or like moving like this is the speed I need to move, precisely, in a way that
Mhm.
like you wouldn't have known before, which is helpful. And so that's one element for sure about the people. The other element might be, maybe they're doing something that you didn't expect. No one should be bringing a cell phone into a clean room environment. But I'm sure somewhere out there there's a deviation that has that on there, where somebody accidentally had their cell phone on them in there, and it started going off, and it was a problem. Or maybe it was in their pocket or something, and calamity. So the idea here, though, is that, there is more data on every aspect of the piece, and with that, you can do a lot, but it requires just a lot of infrastructure that, maybe, you're able to, like a small firm would have difficulty affording this, but like somebody who has, you know a company who has a lot of investment in these pieces obviously has a lot of investment in their batch in the end, and would be able to afford that type of thing. We're talking, on a, let's just say, like a 3,000 square foot ballroom situation where they're producing, and then maybe like a, because space is really helpful as an analog for this, and maybe like a 20,000 square foot warehouse, because I'm using our kind of space as a bit of an example here in my mind. And that type of environment may cost you, in our case, when I've looked at it, we're doing everything bargain in terms of our pricing because we're a nonprofit. But our pricing is probably in the nature of, like, I looked at the upgrade, it's probably going to cost us about between $1 and $6 million to fully, you know, make this the perfect digital twin as much as we can. In our space, and we're a biomanufacturing training center that does pilot batch pre-production, so we have that avenue in there. But we also have some spaces that we don't have the full responsibility that a commercial batch does, and so those elements are a little bit finer. They probably won't require much more though in terms of the investment because there it's just more scrutiny. So there it's just more man hours watching it or
Mm.
more people going into that regard. So it's not really so much the equipment or other investments there. So that's kind of what I've looked at for us. And so I would imagine that that might be a good analog for folks to be able to say, oh, well, okay, well, how much does this cost? What does this do? That's about what it is. And that is again using being able to have one cohesive piece of software versus having lots of software. And if those software integrate, you're fine. All that matters is that you have a really good data lake or a really good data warehouse, and you have somebody who can manage that data well. Because if you have that, like you don't necessarily need the uniform software, but again, it really depends on your people and your process.
Yeah, and this whole time you're talking, I'm thinking all this data centrifugation, is that a word? Is
Consolidation.
seems to be the biggest first step in being able to fully utilize AI. So I would think that a lot of companies are already either doing this or trying to do this to get to the point where they can really start using either AI as a whole or digital twins.
Yeah, I think that people want to, but the thing is, again, it's that data, it's that perfect data problem, right? Um, you know, w- if you don't have all of the data, your AI is going to produce some stuff that's maybe a little bit different. But
Mm,
yeah, no, that's the really cool thing is like I said before, the digital twin AI, that is the thing that makes the digital twin so much more valuable because
yeah.
you can run all those simulations. And running the simulation is like honestly the main point, in my opinion, of the digital twin. Besides like maybe onboarding, you know?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Um, so earlier on, you mentioned, some a little bit too futuristic, vantage points or viewpoints on what digital twins are. But, looking a little bit into the future, like what's actually on the horizon in this space that, maybe isn't being utilized quite yet, or what are some applications that look like they're going to have some promise in pharma
So
manufacturing?
yeah, so virtual inspection. Obviously, one of the cool things about digital twin is that functionally speaking, it makes virtual inspection a whole lot easier. If you have your entire process on there. Now, obviously, that's I don't know, I don't know exactly how many pharmaceutical companies are going to be really keen on that, on sharing all of their data with with these with the group with regulators, depending upon where they are because maybe that's useful, maybe that's not, maybe that, because in my experience, you only want to tell them as much as they have questions for.
Hmm.
Because you don't want to accidentally say something that then they go, okay, well, what does that mean? And then you have to go, oh man, and then you just it's time lost. Like, let's be real. It's if you have an audit that's you're not doing what you get paid for. Um, and so, unless you're the auditor. And so in that situation, you want to get back on you want to get things back on track as soon as possible. So it is about speed. And so you also don't want to have anything, that you want to keep it to the scope that you're in. You don't want to start expanding the scope. Um, so that's, I think, one thing. But the other thing is that, like, again, it might have proprietary components to it that maybe you don't want revealed that you are doing, that you are moving forward
Yeah.
in. But the thing is, at the end of the day, you probably could even spin out an inspection ready version of the model as well. Because if you're already putting in a data lake, you're already putting in a data warehouse, you could very well have it have a second instance of that data that is specific for the auditor. So it's specific to what they're auditing because they're not auditing. Because if you have your entire system on this, the auditor doesn't need to see all of that because that could be multiple facilities. They're only looking at one facility. They're looking at one specific chain. They don't need to see everything here because that's not why they're there. So in that case, it can be helpful, really helpful for virtual inspection in a way that is just second to none. Right now, you're having some questions, you're getting to see some things, but if you have a fully realized digital twin where you actually have the ability to kind of literally do the Gemba walk kind of situation, that's amazing. An auditor can just walk in there and go, well, this is your equipment, this is how it is, especially if when it's real time. You can start to see they can actually you can have an uninterrupted audit. You know what I mean? The idea of a virtual
Mm.
inspection with this type of situation is that your audit does not interrupt your process. Your process does not stop. It continues, and they're actually watching the process as it goes, which is something that is wild. Again, we'll see how many companies are interested in actually utilizing that type of strategy. because I don't know how people make these decisions. But what I can say is that that is a potential reality that is right there in the far future, for regulators to be able to really see. But we see that that same challenge is happening with like AI integrations, where it's like, I'll show okay, they each of them are demanding each other's prompts to like look at these things, but they don't want to do that because, it gets tricky. In trying to determine these types of new technologies in terms of what's a requirement, in terms of reporting, what's a component that you want in there, what's a component that's relevant. What is relevant becomes really hard to determine if you're unfamiliar with the technology. And it's not necessarily specific that either the operator or the regulator or the auditor, has a full understanding of what the technology is that's being applied. So that could be a component that's kind of not there. But largely speaking, though, virtual inspection is a really cool area where digital twin can really potentially in the future expand usefulness across the board. Because again, not losing that time, huge, huge.
Yeah.
I think about all the times where I'm like, oh, well, I was looking forward to seeing these people. Oh, well, they're on an audit. I was like, oh man, okay, well, I'll see them in a week then. Not that it takes that long, but the idea is that I won't see them as often because of that situation. But like, it's there's that. And then you also have, you know, with a really good digital twin, you also have the ability to kind of a train your people faster because with a digital twin, it's sort of like a pilot simulator. You just run them through the simulator a few times, and if you do that, hey, they'll be better when they do it. It's not a replacement for training by any means, but it is helpful, especially with catastrophe training. So the benefit is it's a lot cheaper to set a virtual plant on fire than a real one. And so you can really get a lot of really good things about like these emergency scenarios and things like that in this digital environment. There are so many things when you have a really that future, like, you're walking through, you're seeing all your data, everything's actualized in that way. The things you can do with it are just wild in that sense. You can do that. You can do the emergency scenario. You can do your prep onboarding. You can position your space as you need to. You can also clone your space. So say you need to build a new facility and you want to take the good from your facility now and change it to the facility you want. So you could take the new space that maybe you're moving into an existing building, and that you take that new building's, architecture, you go through, you scan it, and you say, well, what do we want to take? You can just literally just copy your rooms, paste them in there, and then try it out. So just like we do on the small scale with these, like just rearranging the rooms, you can do the same thing, but for your whole plant. And I imagine that speed will be really practical when it comes to trying to not only for scale up purposes, but also for scaling up your entire, production. Instead of just looking at like one building, two buildings, three buildings, you could put out there like that. So I think that's a really cool potential application that we're seeing elements of right now. Because again, this is the idea here is that this is this perfect digital twin that we're moving towards, and that has all this really cool data, is super easy to use. That would be those are some possibilities.
Cool. Very cool. Is there anything else?
One of the big challenges and one of the reasons why I actually created like AI Lit with Rick was because I swear to God, so many people asked me what digital twin was. I had I must have had like 10 different people over the course of like 4 days after I held my AI summit. There was like, what is this? And I'm like, we just told you what it was, but that wasn't enough because they're like, yeah, but I saw that, but like, this is what I see on the internet. And I'm like, this is what I see here. And I'm like, all right, so this is bad. Cause like one of the companies I was working with had actually spent a lot of time, you know, helping people understand what digital twin technology was. And they had basically spent 2 years promoting digital twin technology, but they were promoting it and then defining it as what they were doing, which was a little bit of a difficult situation
Yeah.
because, when you're defining a very wide technology with a very narrow band and you don't, label it a bit more refined, it does make it confusing for people. And they've since adapted. They figured out also because there are so many other people using the term that it's kind of again washed a bit in terms of its market market awareness. So it's hard to to have your brand be that when everyone has a digital twin in terms of some sort of sale thing. And the other thing is that like digital twin without AI is pretty much just a virtual model. Like you can't run the simulations you want to run. You can't do the things you want to do without AI. So like AI is the thing that really makes a digital twin powerful,
Mm.
not just in collection, but also in
And that,
analysis.
yeah.
Because like how many hours does it take a human to read one of these things
Oh
versus
yeah.
versus a generator? Like I said, the needle in a haystack, they can find those errors really quickly, and that's super helpful. So like for me, I'm like, no, that's one of the coolest things about this is that you can really just bring that out.
Yeah. Yeah. Feed
Yeah.
it all into AI.
Yeah. And I think we mentioned some of the companies. I didn't mention the companies by name, but um what they're doing is really cool. The idea of having the sensors on the things, I always thought because one of the things that I put out was the human AI training parallelization, and part of that methodology was like, okay, every step in sync, every step in sync. And you know, when we get to the manufacturing component, one of our hurdles, and the reason why I've kind of mapped out that pricing was because we were like, how do we properly you know, do this? How do we do this in a way that is affordable? Because we're a scrappy nonprofit. You know,
Right.
we need to stretch that dollar as far as possible. And, for us, it's going, okay, well, these are somewhat novel technologies. Maybe some people who are building out some stuff would be interested in partnering us in some way. Some are and some aren't. Some give us great pricing. Some give us like pricing that like I'm like, we're not, that's okay. I get that they're expensive to make and hold, but I do want to point out like we're still a nonprofit. So like we can't necessarily afford that kind of pricing. And so that's kind of how I determined some of that pricing there is I was like, nah, it's a little expensive. And the thing is, that's just the like setup, maintenance and stuff, like with a person and things. We're blessed in the fact that we're a nonprofit, so we have volunteers and we have volunteers who are data scientists, and that's super helpful. Not everybody has volunteer data scientists who are willing to comb your data and help you out, but
No.
most people wouldn't want that because then you don't have the same level of security as you do with somebody who's an employee.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so there are trade-offs and everything. Human training parallelization to me was like a different kind of digital twin because like our goal was to have digital twins and help it inform them, um, along with a whole bunch of other things. But it's definitely it's it can be easier or it can be more difficult depending upon how much money you have and how interested in the application everyone is. Because one of the barriers that I've encountered before too was like people didn't want to see the digital twin working, because they were concerned about the monitoring. So they were concerned about the level of cameras and the level of sensors. Your second generation employees that come in once the effect has been in place, totally different situation. But the first generation of employees who are working on it usually have a mixed response because it's a type of surveillance that's more than they had before. And some people get very concerned when surveillance is on. It doesn't matter that to them it's like, well, if you're not doing anything you shouldn't be doing, you shouldn't be concerned, right? Yeah, but
Right.
at the same point, there are still a lot of people who get very concerned around surveillance, and some people who, when surveilled, act differently. In fact, most people, when surveilled, act differently. And the problem is that if that occurs, does that mean more errors will occur? And so that's why
Well,
the
yeah, you're
second
just
gen,
not getting a true picture of
yeah,
how things actually operate. Yeah.
yeah, no, that happened. It's a psychological effect, and so the idea is
Yeah.
that the second generation of employees, though, who are on the system, they have it, that's used to it, so it's something that's built in. They're just kind of they're already operating as exactly as they would have otherwise. So there's no change.
They don't
But
know
the
any
first
different.
gen, yeah, yeah, but the first generation, though, no, they have that they have to deal with that change. They have to figure out how to adapt, and and
Yeah.
it is something that like I've had to have discussions with our groups and go, well, how do you feel about this? And most of them have been like, well, I don't really like the idea of being surveilled all the time. And I'm like, I do get that. I get that, like, maybe that's not that, but then I remind them, I'm like, just so you know, it's not like a person is like watching you. It's different than that. And so it is there is a certain kind of like pull out that has to happen mentally. That people have to go, oh, okay, well, this is where I am, this is what's happening here. And yes, it's kind of in a way not different than like your CCTV that's already happening. You already have CCTV. You already monitored on no matter walking around there, but you're just not thinking about that. In this case, these sensors are much more precise. And I mean, I'm sure that there's to a degree where some people are like, well, I don't want to get written up for accidentally like going home with X, you know, or accidentally doing this, and it's sort of like, well, what was the accident? What's the scale of the problem? Um, and I can see how under certain management structures, people might be disinclined, right? If you know your manager is a micromanager and has access to this, that might not be fun. That might make for a difficult workplace.
Yeah.
So, the people matter a lot. And making sure that the people are ready for this type of technology matters a whole heck of a lot. You need to have your people need to be on board. And if they're not on board, like it's just not going to happen. The way you want it to, at the very least. It'll happen. It just something will go wrong, and then your second
You
generation
might
of
lose some
employees will
people.
fix that. Yeah, yeah, you probably will actually. One way or another, whether they're by function or by form, right?